I'll let Tomas introduce a little bit himself, and then I'll go through the lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Razvan, for the introduction. So my name's Tomas Mikolov. I used to work actually at Facebook AI Research, which is still here in the slide, but now I'm working at the university here in Prague. That's the ČVUT University, Czech Technical University. And this talk is going to be kind of like an introduction to natural language processing. And Razvan will be helping me to kind of like make it as exciting as possible. So let's see how it goes. The structure of the tutorial is a little bit long, so it's supposed to be kind of longer than 1 hour talk. So I guess we'll be not able to cover all these topics. But just to quickly describe, I will talk about like some basic machine learning applied to NLP, some introduction to neural networks to explain what deep learning is about, which I'm sure you all already have heard about. But I think that it's always nice to see some different angles on the same topic. And then I will go over some very basic applications of neural nets to distributed representation learning in text, some efficient text classification, neural net language models, and some open research problems at the end, if there will be enough time. So for the introduction, I guess I can go just quickly over it, because it's quite obvious that there's tons of need to be able to process language with computers in many of these big companies nowadays that basically are like just maintaining huge data sets made out of the text, out of video, and so on. And the text is actually quite an important part of what we are dealing with if you are working at, say, Google search or some machine translation applications, or if you want to understand the posts at Facebook and so on. There's like tons of need to be able to basically do this as well as you can. And to start like from the beginning, I maybe can say something about motivation. Like I think that some of the concepts that I'm gonna talk about are kind of like the basic stepping stones, but I think that sometimes people underestimate these basic concepts and they just want to jump right into the most fancy deep learning stuff that has been published like 1 month ago, which I think can be a mistake, because often like the new ideas are interesting, but not always they will work as well as advertised, and we can actually talk about it later in more detail, what is actually the cause. But in short, there are often like simple old solutions that are like from the last century that are just sufficient to solve a problem that you are dealing with, and the fancy solutions are not always the best option because they can be just much more computationally demanding than a simpler solution. So it's actually really good to know the simple approaches and understand actually what is the core of what we are doing today, and that basically this AI stuff is still like far ahead of us, and the computers don't really understand language, but we are dealing with more like statistics. So this is still kind of like just some introduction slide. So I will just skip over it. But let's say that we have like these basic concepts that I would like to explain in a short way what they actually mean. And it's kind of like pre-neural networks. So n-grams used to be like a dominant approaches to language modeling for kind of like a couple of dozens of years. And actually, when I was doing a PhD myself as a student, people did believe that these models are going to be unbeatable forever whenever we have large training sets, because they just work so well that it's impossible to do any better. There are some equations here. Maybe I can just explain it in a simpler way. Let's assume that you want to compute the probability of a sentence, and you will just do it in such a way that you just have some probabilistic model that tells you what is the probability of the first word. Then you multiply this by a probability of the second word conditioned on the first word, and then times the probability of the third word based on the history, which is the previous 2 words, and so on. And these probabilities are estimated from count. So you take, say, all English Wikipedia, and you count how many times did you see these trigrams, bigrams, these sequences of words like this is and this is. You just count how many times did you see this. So basically see that if that follow this context, like say 10% of the time, then the probability of following this is 10%. That's pretty much it. So it's really like a trivial technique that has been already used by Claude Shannon to estimate the entropy of printed English, as he did call it. And it's like a very famous paper from, I think, the 50s in the last century. So really, this idea is very old, but it works also like very well in practice. I will not go over the smoothing techniques, but there are some slight issues if you apply it as I just described. You have to deal with the counts that are basically zero, and you have to smooth these probabilities so that you don't have any infinities. Basically, if you just do it in the naive way. Then the other interesting concept that has been like very famous is the concept of word classes. That actually intuitively you can see that many words share kind of like the parameters in the language, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Thursday, and so on. They are all kind of like similar words in some sense. They occur in the same contexts, and if you are trying to estimate some language model or basically some mathematical model of the language, probably you should take advantage of this fact that there are some words that are sharing parameters so that you have a more robust model that can be trained from less data to work basically better, to generalize better. And the most basic approach is to just assign every word to a single class. So you will form a class in 1, for example, here that contains all the words that describe colors, and class 2 that contain all the words that describe countries. We will later see that this can be generalized further, where actually the words can be seen more like some vectors in some high-dimensional space, where actually you don't really have just assignment of a single word to a single class, but a word is distributed over like this space, so it can have many angles of similarity with other words. But this is basically the most basic idea that is, again, it's coming at least to the 80s when it was already like very popular, but I'm sure that it has been already used even before that. There's this cool paper from Peter Brown from 1992 about class-based n-gram models of natural language. So if you like these kind of like historical papers, you can check it. And it's basically about efficient algorithm, how to estimate these word classes from some training sets. There's this other example. Basically, why would you even want to do this? Let's assume that in your training data, you see a sentence, the weather was nice on Monday. And if you actually have some concept of classes in your model, then your model can actually already like extrapolate to understand that some other sentences can be valid. For example, the weather was nice on Tuesday, the weather was nice on Wednesday. You don't have to see these sentences in the training data. But if your model has this concept of classes built in itself, then it can already generalize to these contexts. So it can, for example, the machine translation system can say that these sentences have a reasonable probability and that they can be decoded even if these sentences never appeared in the training data. By the way, this is exactly what neural networks later are doing, just in a more like, I would say, straightforward and even like a better way that they can actually generalize to novel sentences because of this concept of clustering and sharing parameters among similar histories. Then the other like important concept that is again very trivial, but it's very difficult to do better if you really use it in some applications, is the concept of representations of words using one-hot encoding, which basically is like an approach that you just compute a vocabulary over all your training data. Let's say that in this toy example, you just have 5 different words. Monday, Tuesday is today. And then you represent each word by a vector that has unit length and is orthogonal to everything else, which in the most basic case here is basically that you just assign 1 to the point where there's this word in the vocabulary and 0 to everything else. And actually these representations are mostly used, often used as the basically representation of words that, for example, neural networks do see at their input layers. Of course, this can be extended to not represent just a single word, but to represent some sequence of words by using back of words representations. In this case, let's assume that that we have a sentence, today is a Monday, and then we will just basically sum all these one-hot representations to form a vector that's basically here like 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, which means that basically this back of words representation is like a way how to understand which words were actually in the sentence while ignoring the sentence order. So actually the back of words representation of a sentence, today is a Monday, or a sentence is a Monday today, they are exactly the same, even if the word order is different. So obviously, backwards representations are not that great because they destroy the word ordering, but at the same time they are like pretty good representations that again like transform the sentences to some numeric representations that can be used later by machine learning algorithms, and they are not that easy to overcome, especially if you extend this concept to back-of-n-grams representations, which already has some notion of local word ordering. The other concept that I think is like very simple and at the same time very difficult to do better than it is the concept of logistic regression. It's called in the NLP community maximum entropy models. And you can actually see there's a neural network without hidden layers, which means that you have just basically an input vector and then some output vector. So I think that in many cases when people are solving some simplistic problems in NLP, for example, text classification, then logistic regression is something that I think people should start with, and often it's just enough. Then we have also like some code shared on the web here. I guess I can share the slides later so that people can actually use these links, but it's not that important anymore. I think there's tons of like toyish examples of how to code like neural networks and logistic regression and PCA and whatever. So I don't think it's that important. Let's go further. There's this more like historical like approach to classification. I'm saying historical because again, like when I was a student, support vector machines were very popular because they are like conceptually kind of interesting. And there was this big book written by Vladimir Vapnik, statistical learning theory, that's kind of like proving that under some assumptions that are of course unrealistic, these models are kind of like perfect. But the main concept was that when you are building a classifier, you should choose such a decision plane that will be able to distinguish the data to be basically the data points should be as far away from this decision line as possible. So I think it's nice, but I don't think we have to go very much in detail because it's quite complicated in the end, and I would say it's not really used anymore because it was like how to say it. It was popular because it was easily accessible through the open source code that people could use as VMs very quickly. And there was a lot of fancy math around it, so it looked cool. But the interesting conclusion was that in practice, it was working more or less the same as the logistic regression, which was much simpler. And I think that's a story that I think reoccurs in the machine learning community again and again, that people sometimes believe that we have like some amazing new technique that is very complicated and works amazingly well, only after to be found after say 5, 10, sometimes even 15 years that this amazing technique is actually kind of useless and that you can solve problems with something much simpler. And it was all the time in front of everybody, just people that kind of fail to see it, which find funny that it still is happening, but that's basically the life of researchers, that even today, I would say that 50% of the things that you guys may learn about that are like super important and definitely working great are actually totally useless. But the thing is, as researchers, we never really know what is actually the right thing and the wrong thing. So it's basically good to be somewhat skeptical and critical about what information you are learning about at the moment. So that's the summary of this first short part. Then there's like just some other keywords that I did put here, like that if you want to work on unsupervised image reduction, then you should learn definitely about PCA first before you try to use neural networks. Then for clustering, the k-means is kind of like the most basic obvious idea to try. And that's about it. Then I will go to the second part, which is sort of like some sort of like introduction to neural networks. Guess I can go over it kind of quickly because I'm sure you guys did already see it. But I will still try to say something about it. Here I have just some warnings again in this slide that basically neural networks in NLP are like very much used today, but they don't really solve problems that you can't solve with the previous techniques that I was showing before. Like you can solve machine translation using engrams. You can solve text classification using logistic regression. You don't have to use neural networks. Just neural networks at the moment work somewhat better because they can model some regularities in the data that say engrams cannot model. So it's kind of like often working better, but it's not kind of like that we would have some applications that only neural networks can solve, and you can't do well with something else. Still, like it's good to be a few percent better than the other techniques if you want to win, for example, some benchmarks in competitions and so on. So to the neural nets, there's this model of perceptron where you have some input synapses, which are basically the incoming signals that are multiplied by the weights, which is exactly what you are learning actually. And then you have some non-linearity. So you basically sum this these incoming signals multiplied by the weights in the neuron, apply the non-linearity, and the value that you compute in this way is basically sent to the output from this neuron. And then there's this neuroscientific terminology that the output is called axon or whatever, but maybe some slight warning that whenever people are making some analogies between these artificial neural networks and the biological neural networks, that it's very like kind of stretched, because the biological neural networks, of course, are totally different thing than the mathematical artificial neural networks. And I would say that this is more like for historical purposes that we still call these models neural networks. I think that nonlinear projections of data would be a better name for these models, but I'm sure that people would not like it so much. Also, it would be more accurate. So, okay, here I have just the slide that I was just saying. And then there's this activation function. It was also like, if you would look into the history, there was a lot of like choices for the nonlinearity. The sigmoid used to be very popular in my days. Then there was this rectified linear unit, which kind of replaced it because it was simpler and was working also better in deep networks. Empirically, of course, like we don't really have proofs for these things. But then there was like tons of new nonlinearities. Like as you can imagine, you can just design your own nonlinearity. The main point is that there needs to be some nonlinearity in the neural network, because otherwise you are just composing some linear combinations of projections which would not be able to detect some features. Basically, it can be mathematically shown that the nonlinearity is necessary, as for example was written in this perceptron's book by Minsky and Papert. Okay, so that's actually going to this example of this, like again, historical example. That's the exclusive OR problem shown here, where we have two inputs, and you are supposed to say whether the inputs are the same or not. So if you have a graphical representation, then you have like the blue circles, which represent 0, 0, and 1, 1 points, and then there's the red circles, which are 1, 0, and 0, 1. And there's actually no way how you can actually put this linear decision plane, like how to position it in such a way that you can distinguish with just one plane these blue and red circles. And for that, you will actually need this nonlinearity in the model. There's also like some NLP example that if you want to understand that some combination of words has a different meaning than just their sum, or basically linear combination, then again you will need some nonlinearity. But back to this XOR function that was used by Minsky in his book to show that neural networks without basically hidden layers or without nonlinearity cannot actually solve this at all. And then he did extend that example to show that if you have a parity function where you have n bits at the input, then you can't actually say like if the number of ones and zeros is the same or not. That's basically the parity function. You can't really say it efficiently even if you have one hidden layer, because he did prove how many neurons you will need at least. And then there's this result that if you use more than one hidden layer, that you can do it, you can solve this function much more efficiently. I think only 2 hidden layers were enough. So that was more like from my point of view, at least, like motivation to think of models that will be using more hidden layers because they can more compactly represent some patterns. Okay, so hidden layer is something that I didn't describe yet, but it's basically the neurons between input and output layers are kind of like intermediate results of the computation. And if you have a hidden layer that has the non-linearity, you can actually solve this XOR problem by basically having two neurons that detect different kind of like subregions of the original input space, and by their combination that can be linear, you can detect the blue circles by basically being on the left side of the first line and the right side of the second line, and just combine it together. Also, like, it should be said that one hidden layer is actually not enough. There used to be like this popular argument that if you have one hidden layer in your network, that is basically a universal approximator argument, that you can represent any function up to arbitrary precision. It's going to be shown mathematically, but we can also see that the intuitive explanation is kind of like trivial. We can't actually represent efficiently all the functions with a single layer, a single hidden layer, which is actually the whole point of deep learning, at least from my point of view, that there are functions that you can represent quite well with more hidden layers, but with a single hidden layer, you will just need too many neurons, which means that you will have too many parameters, which means that you will need way too many training examples so that your model works well, which again means that there will be limited generalization of the model. So this is just the graphical representation, how we can draw, like, each circle is basically a neuron, then you have these weights, which are the arrows that you train. And this is basically the structure of like a neural network with one hidden layer. Then there's the objective function, which is something that you try to optimize. So it's kind of obvious. Then there's this concept of unsupervised and supervised training. When you know basically what you want your model to be doing, when you can compose a large data set of labeled examples where you have an input vector and the target desired output vector that you know that the model should be producing, then you can use the supervised learning. The unsupervised learning, in my opinion, is kind of like still like a big unsolved question in machine learning, how to do it really well, where you actually don't know what the model should be producing. And then there's, of course, also the concept of self-supervised learning, where you will use the training data themselves to generate the training signal, which is actually the case of language modeling, as we will see later, where you actually can use the next word in a sequence to give you basically this supervision so that your model knows pretty much what it should be doing. The training is done by many different training algorithms. I would say that the most basic and important one is the stochastic gradient descent. Again, people try to come up with many variants, and for some time they didn't even believe that it works much better. But in the end, I'm not sure myself if there are algorithms that are as successful as SGD, and that's actually quite trivial. I'm not gonna describe it in all the details, but basically there's this forward pass in a neural network where you just take the input features, you send them to the hidden layer by doing these weighted matrix times vector multiplications, as I was showing before. You basically just apply this this simple equation to every neuron to compute its output values. And that's basically all that we have to do for the forward pass. Then for the SGD, for training the network, that gets more complicated. You need basically these target output vectors, which can be, for example, using this one-hot encoding, and that needs to come from this training set, for example, produced by humans, some labels. And then once basically you compute some output vector from a neural network, you compare it to the vector that, like, kind of like this desired output vector that the neural network should have been producing. That will tell you what is the error vector. Not only that the neural network made some mistakes, but in which neurons at the output layer were there mistakes, what was their magnitude, and then you try to minimize this error vector by changing the weight slightly in the neural net, so that next time the same training example will be seen, that the error vector will be smaller. Of course, you can be wondering why you don't just minimize the error right away after every training example, but that would be changing the weights too quickly, so that the network would be forgetting pretty much after every training example what it has been trained on before. So you just basically make small changes of the weight so that there's some smooth progress towards some final solution. And here is just the graphical representation, so that the backpropagation algorithm goes exactly the opposite way than the forward pass. So now you are propagating the error vectors by going backwards, and that's pretty much it. Then there's this concept of learning rates and so on, but I guess I can just skip that because it's kind of like the details that are actually important, but for this tutorial it's not that crucial, the same with regularization and so on. So just for the summary, I think that the SGD and backpropagation are the core algorithms that everybody should know, because they often work really well. And I'm not even sure if we can do really that much better on large data sets than these. Of course, there's tons of other things that you either have to do manually, or you can actually do by some meta algorithm that will be trying all these combinations on your behalf, like what is the type of activation function, how many hidden layers you will use, what is the size of the hidden layers, what is the starting learning rate, how quickly you reduce the learning rate, and so on and so on. But that's why it was also like difficult for people to start using neural networks back in the days, because you have to have a lot of experience with these. And I think it's getting much easier today, because you can use some hyperparameter tuning tools that will just try these for you, and will basically save you time. Then there's this slide about like the relationship between neural network and logistic regression. I think I have a bit more things later in the slides, but I will skip over it because it's not that crucial. Then the deep learning, as I was explaining, the whole point is that with more hidden layers, you can represent functions more compactly, which means that you will need less parameters in your model to learn some regularities, and then it will be just easier to learn these from less training examples. So, of course, it doesn't happen all the time. There are problems where you can just keep adding hidden layers and you will see no improvements. So again, it's kind of like empirical thing often, that for some problems, a lot of hidden layers help you, for example, image recognition. And for some tasks, like we will see later, like text classification, it's not that useful often to use more hidden layers, especially if you have very small amounts of data or very large amounts of training data. And for that, there are some examples, but in short, you should basically try it on your own and not use excessively many hidden layers, because that just makes the computation slower. And then there's this universal approximator, as I was saying, that there will be some graphical explanation. Basically, if you have some complicated function, then the universal approximator argument only says that that you will be able to represent it to arbitrary precision, because you can have like neurons that will be reacting just to some very small subset of the input space, and it will basically work as a lookup table, so it will just memorize what the values to output. So the universal approximator says nothing about generalization. It just says that if you have infinitely large neural network, then the neurons can work basically as a lookup table and just memorize any function, which is fine, but it's definitely not exciting, because that's nothing about learning. It's just about memorizing. And again, that was the reference to Minsky's book. Here's just some graphical representation that you can have like more hidden layers shown as basically these boxes. So I will be showing later, but that's basically it. There's also like this interesting thing that I was slowly mentioning before, that often people believe, like the whole community believes in ideas that are actually wrong. So some 10 years ago, I think it was still the case, maybe a little bit more than 10 by now, that you can't actually use stochastic gradient descent and backpropagation to train these deep networks, that is neural networks with more than 2 hidden layers, because it's just not going to work. And everybody did take it as a fact. Well, it actually turned out to be not true. And there was actually more of these examples, like recurrent networks were supposed to be unstable and also like not possible to train them with SGD, which was like from which the community did believe maybe for some 20 years, maybe from the beginning of 90s, maybe again to like 2010 or so. So there's often like a lot of these myths that turn out later are wrong. For example, I still remember as a student, one of the first examples of deep networks that did have reasonable performance. They're using this layer-wise greedy pre-training. So you would train only one hidden layer at a time and just adding one by one to the model before applying SGD at the end. And actually, I would say most of the community did believe that this is like super important, you have to do it. And only after a couple of years, it was actually found that it's totally useless and you can be just skipping this pre-training and just train the whole model like end-to-end with SGD and just do nothing complicated, and it was just working well. So just again, like some warnings that if you just jump on the ship and just use the most fancy latest thing that was published last month, it's not necessarily the best idea that it really works well. Maybe there's just tons of training examples and very nicely labeled data sets behind it, but it's not always clear that the latest ideas are really that great. Well, it always takes basically like a couple of years for the community to realize whether it's really working or not. So for that reason, like deep learning is still like an open research problem. There's tons of things that we don't really know that well. So I would say there's a lot of hype, also like because many people just want to sell their papers, so they will just promise you anything, so that you cite them. So you know how it works. So I think that that's the end of this introduction to NLP basics, and I will be going to more like applied ideas, like how to actually learn some representations of language, of words, and how to train language models. So maybe we can have just some short break, because before I go to this,
okay, yeah, let's do a few questions. Let me present. Sorry. Okay, can you can see my screen? Okay, so let's go with the first question, which is, what was the inspiration behind Word2Vec?
Yeah, the inspiration, I will be actually going to this in the second part of the tutorial, because there is Word2Vec described, but I maybe can already say it.
Yeah,
maybe during the slides actually, because it's gonna be better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so leave it to the slides then.
Yeah.
Do you think current large parameter NLP is memorization or generalization, or?
Well, I would say that it's like 99% of memorization actually. In other words, I think that we still need to come up with some new ideas so that we build models that really understand language. I think that most of the things that we have today is basically just memorization, yes.
Okay. What is your opinion of in-context learning, like GPT-2, I guess? Is specifying NLP tasks by natural instruction feasible in production?
I'm actually not familiar with this context learning. As far as I know, this GPT 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever is the current number, is just bigger and bigger language models, which is totally fine, because like having a pre-trained language model that you don't have to train on your own is definitely going to be very useful to many people. But when it comes to some specific details, I would be somewhat like not that much convinced that you need to do something really special on top of language modeling. So yeah, not really any clear answer.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the question is also referring to this idea of using, I guess it was GPT-3 as to basically like a bot to communicate with and to do things like write code or write particular technical things. Do you think we're there yet, where we can have the systems that can actually write instructions for you, or is it not there?
I think actually the kind of like the language models are like mostly like a basic sequence prediction models, so you don't have to apply them just to language, but to like artificial languages as well, like to code. that's fine. I'm not sure how well we can apply them to like generating new code, but because there's a lot of like repetition when you are when you are coding, I'm totally convinced that you can develop tools, for example, that will be able to tell you like semantic mistakes during your coding, that will be highlighting like some parts that look unlikely from the language model perspective, so that it will be easier for you to find bugs, to correct the code. I think that would be quite doable.
Okay. Any guidelines on when to opt for SVM or logistic regression against neural nets?
Yeah, well, in a short way, I would say that I'm not a big fan of SVMs anymore, because I think that they are just overcomplicated techniques that don't do anything really important that the simpler ones do. So I would say that the logistic regression is fine as a first choice if you are solving kind of like simple tasks, like say sentiment analysis, like some simple classification where you are just basically mostly when the machine really needs to scan just some keywords from the say input sentence, and where there's not much anything complicated going on. Basically, whenever Beckov engrams can be a good representation, then logistic regression on top of it is like the first choice. But otherwise, neural networks are gonna be working better whenever you need to deal with the word order, like in language modeling, machine translation, and tasks like that.
Okay, so and then just the last question, and I go back to the slides.
Sure.
So what are our current beliefs that might not be true? Do you have an intuition, or yeah?
Well, I would have a lot of intuitions, but it would be a different talk, I guess, because I would have to talk for too long. But I think that many of our current intuitions, if not all, actually about AI and like basically when machine learning is going, are like questionable at best. For example, I'm not convinced that it's such a great idea to keep trying to make references between artificial neural networks, machine learning, and neuroscience, because I think that neuroscience is such a distant topic that it's kind of like as if we would be trying to combine neural networks like the artificial ones and say archaeology, like or whatever. Like yes, you can do it, but really why? I don't really see much point, and there was so much resources kind of like spent on this direction of trying to kind of like or some bridge between machine learning and whatever is happening in the biological brains. And I didn't see any real outcome out of it, but I'm quite skeptical about it. But then there's a lot of other concepts that are today like considered as definitely great, and there are like lectures about it, like say deep reinforcement learning. Does it actually work? Or I know that I'm being too critical maybe to some things, but I think often, like when you are solving these problems, like say playing some games, computer games with machine learning algorithms, that you can use as a simple baseline, like some iterative random search. In other words, like these evolutionary strategies, algorithms that were already known in the 80s in the last century, and often it will work okay-ish. Compared to like say this deep reinforcement learning, and I did see these examples also like published a couple of years ago, but they never go mainstream. And again, like when you actually see these techniques fail, it's when you need to generalize to some new context, when you change some pixel in some game and it all stops working. That's the case of these evolutionary algorithms, but it's exactly the same in these complicated new versions of the reinforcement learning algorithms. I think that we are to solve AI, that maybe it would be good if people would be thinking on their own and trying to come up with some complementary ideas to whatever we have today. Because sometimes I'm somewhat disappointed by the machine learning community in a sense that we have like so much interest and so much money in the community, but in the end, I almost see kind of like tens of thousands of clones working on the same 3-4 ideas while making little progress. So I really think that one of the things that I would like to make as a message today is that there should be more diversity. Many of the concepts that are today sold as like great solutions are actually not really working at all. And if we are to solve some new tasks that are today unsolvable, that people should be thinking about their own solutions and not really buy that something that is currently mainstream, that it's a great thing. It's often like just PR and just like some like famous groups are trying to get their papers more cited, so they will just get it to the media. But I think that the scientific progress is also there.
Cool. Let's go back to the slides. Let me
Sure.
stop presenting, and yeah, I think you need to click resume.
Resume.
If you got, or is it? Or oh, sorry.
Is it visible? Because I still am in this presentation mode.
Yeah. No. If you go at the bottom of the screen, there should be where the present now was. There should be like resume presentation.
No, I don't have it, but I can exit and just
Yeah.
restart
Okay.
it.
Maybe
Okay.
exit and.
Okay, so I'm exiting it now. A bit slow. Present again. Is it now it's loading? Is it visible?
No, sorry. If you go to the to the Meet Hangouts
Oh, I see.
link, and then at the bottom where you had present.
Oh, I see actually
Okay.
here.
You
Oh,
click
okay.
resume, and then we can go.
Resume presenting.
Perfect.
Okay. Great.
Okay. So
So I'm back, slide 58.
okay.
So
let's.
now to more like practical tasks. Actually, that's the first question that we did skip, which was like when we did go to Word2Vec, and what is it actually? The very basic intuition is that if you want to apply neural networks to NLP, that I was actually facing as a student in 2006. I didn't actually know how to code neural networks a bit more than a single hidden layer. So I wanted to build a language model, and I did not know how to code actually this version that Yoshua Bengio did propose in 2003. So I did made my own version, which just used two neural networks, and each had just a single hidden layer. The first one was learning some word features in this continuous space, actually the same as Word2Vec. And in the most basic case, it was just this bigram neural language model where you encode at the input layer the previous word in a sentence, and the next word is what the network is trying to predict at the output layer. So there's basically no other context than just the previous word. That's why it's a bigram model. And it actually did work okay. You should learn some representations of words that if you look at them like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on, they will have like very similar vector representations, where these representations are actually like what is this this input word that is actually encoded at the input layer using one of encoding. How is it actually connected to the hidden layer? So there's this dense vector of numbers, and this was basically like the most like trivial version of the Word2Vec. And then you can actually use these Word2Vec features to create a history of, say, 5 words and train a single hidden layer neural network language model that will be predicting the next word using this like history of 5 words. So that's like from my diploma thesis. So in the beginning, the motivation for me was that I just didn't know how to code the more complicated things. But when I was actually working on Word2Vec at Google, there was already like after like many years when I already had a lot of experience with recurrent networks and so on. So back in those days, that was like 2012. My main motivation was that I did see people actually learning the word features using full neural language models, which were like computationally demanding, and people even like Google Brain were running these models on like hundreds of machines, training for like weeks and weeks. And to me, it seemed totally wasteful because from my experience, it was just necessary to have like these simplistic models that don't understand the word order, but that just needs to have some context at the input layer. And I was convinced that we can basically solve the same task even better and simpler by something that is like 10,000 times faster. So you could actually train a better model like on a single machine in a few minutes than what people were doing back then with these hundreds of computers over weeks, which actually turned out to be true. And then there was this Word2Vec paper and the open source code, and many people did continue using it. So here are just kind of like the slides about like I will probably skip over it because it's a bit boring because it's the history of these word vectors, because I was not the first one to observe that there are these interesting properties of some of the vectors that similar words are close to each other and so on. It goes back to at least Jeff Hinton and similar guys in the PDP group who were working on these in the 80s in the last century. But again, like we don't really need deep learning to learn lower vectors. It's basically just these like simplistic neural networks that just have basically this concatenation of a couple of words at the input. So just to get to some of the results, one of the things that I did observe, which actually people did find kind of like some miracle almost, that there are some of these regularities in these vector spaces where you can see that it's not just like the word classes that the word would be together with the words of the same sense in the same class. But there are different subspaces in these vector spaces. So, for example, you see that the word king is related to the word queen in some direction in these vector spaces, but in other direction, it's related to the plural version of itself. And you can even form like these like analogy equations by basically just adding and subtracting the words from each other. So if you form an equation king minus man plus woman, where you replace each of these words by its word vector that was trained, for example, on English Wikipedia, then you will obtain some vector and you do the nearest neighbor search where you discard all these input words and you look for the first different word that occurs around this result of this equation, and you will find the word queen. And there was many other examples that were working. Like we did even make some data set with JetSwike in 2012 that were like these analogy examples, and we had like some reasonable accuracy. I don't remember, it was maybe 60%, but it was definitely doing much better than just random guessing, of course. And at Google, I did make some more like semantically oriented data set, which had like these more complicated questions from like the human point of view. Of course, for a machine that just sees all these words as one of n codes, actually all these data sets are kind of tough. But it was working well. I did extend it to some phrases as well. So here is basically the graphical representation of like how the model actually looks like. You have, for example, this Yoshua Bengio's model that I already mentioned before, where you would have three words at the input layer. Then you have some projection layer, which was linear, and then you have the hidden layer that was non-linear at the output layer. And people who are training these models, even like people who are interested not in the language modeling, but just in obtaining the word vectors, so they would train this model for like, again, like for weeks and so on, because it was computationally very demanding. And then they would throw away the weight matrices V and W, and they would keep just the word vectors U. And from my point of view, it was totally wasteful, because you spend actually almost 100% of your time by updating the B and W matrices, while the U was the sparse matrix where you always access just a single row, because the input is encoded using one of encoding. So if you look at this, then I think it's like obvious to ask, well, can we do something better, where actually we would be updating most of the time the parameters that we actually care about? And well, you actually can, because can look back at this bigram language model that I was mentioning before, where we can actually add the context without actually adding the hidden layer. So you just basically sum all these word vectors around some position in a sentence that we are trying to predict, and you just sum them together, and that's this continuous back of words architecture. And again, trained with SGD and so on, and it was working well. This model will not be a good language model because it does not understand the word order. Like in this projection layer, where we are just summing the weighted combination of the input vectors, you don't really see very well like which word was before both word. Like the word order gets destroyed the same way as in the back of words representations. So it's not going to be a good language model, but it's totally fine. Empirically, we did see that it's totally fine if you just learn the word vectors. And there's this skipgram, which is basically just the opposite architecture, where when you take some word in a sentence and you try to predict the nearby words, and again, you don't care about the positions, and then use the SGD and everything. Then there are some tricks how to make it really fast, like the hierarchical softmax and negative sampling, but I guess I can just skip these because we don't have that much time, and that's just like the training details how to make it fast and efficient. This was basically the comparison that I was talking about. Like before the Word2Vec papers was published, many people were using either Ronan Colbert's models or were like a couple of re-implementations of neural networks where people would train these language models for like weeks or even months, and then they would take the word vectors and use them in NLP applications when they were actually working kind of fine. But on these analogy datasets, you see that they are not working that well because the accuracy was at best like 25% with my recurrent network language model. But then when you use the word vectors, train on much more data, much more quickly in like a couple of minutes using the efficient algorithms, then you would do much better in these analogy tasks, like by tons. Like you can go from like run-ons to 11% to hours like 72, and later like even like 90% with fastText. So you could do definitely much better. And it was similar in the NLP task that basically the word-to-vec features were working much better than the previous generation of features coming from the more computationally complex language models. And of course, this is published somewhere on the web. There are some few examples. Maybe I can just stop at some slides just so you can see that it was working quite well. Like I, for example, did like this example that you can form these analogy equations like sushi minus Japan plus Germany gives you bratwurst and so on. So it was a lot of fun actually to play with it, I must say. So that was actually pretty cool. On the language modeling side that I will be just talking about a bit later, you can also like see some cool results by sampling, for example, the new sentences. There's also this visualization where you just take some words that represent the countries and some words that represent the capital cities, and you just plot it using PCA into 2 dimensions. Basically plot these word vectors in 2 dimensions. And surprisingly, it was, at least at the time, surprisingly, it was working so well that it did arrange all the countries and capital cities in such a way that there's kind of like almost one direction which you go from the country to its capital city. So basically, the gray arrows were added manually. The model just basically just sees the Wikipedia and no labels. There's no human intervention to end up with this picture. So you see basically the power of statistics here. Okay, then there's something about phrases. Let's skip that. Of course, like intuitively, you can wonder if all these language spaces are similar across languages, and the answer is yes. We did try it between English and Spanish, where you just need to rotate these images so they correspond to each other. But basically, these high-dimensional representations of languages that you can learn from say Wikipedia or some similar data sets. These language spaces will just look like geometrically very similar, even if it's in Spanish or German or English or whatever. You just need to rotate them so they would overlap. So we did it in some supervised way back in the days, and later people did find that you can do it even like in almost unsupervised way, where you just try to make an overlap between these language spaces, and then you can actually solve in this way somewhat the unsupervised machine translation, where you don't see any labeled examples, you don't see any pairs of sentences that are translated, but you see just large quantities of monolingual data, and you can already perform some sort of translation. So it was kind of cool. Okay, there was also like this further work that we did with the fastText project, which was extending the word-to-vec. There was some slight controversy coming from the NLP group from Stanford, who did develop the GLAF model, which was kind of like it was very, very similar to the word-to-vec, but instead of like computing the whole model in one go, you would split it into 2 parts. And then they did train this model on like huge data set, the common crawl, basically a lot of data from the web, I think like 600 billion words. And it was working better than the word-to-vec model trained on less words, which I think is not surprising. But when you would train the word-to-vec on the same amount of the data, then it turned out that it's actually much better than the GLAF. So I think that's why the GLAF model is controversial, because it's actually like a worse technique, but trained on more data than the original word-to-vec. But of course, like we did extend word-to-vec into fastText. Then we did add also some subword features, which is especially good for some non-English languages like Czech, for example, or Polish and so on, where you have like this inflections. The vocabulary is much larger, and you really want to see some structure over the word at the input. And then you see that if you train the graph and fastText on comparable data sets coming from similar sources, then you just get much better with fastText, which again is worth to work with the support features, which maybe we are not even using in this table. We just added them at the end. So that has been published like 2 years ago. So yeah, it was evaluated on these analogies, reward similarity datasets from Stanford actually, and Stanford question answering dataset where these features were used basically as some input features for some other systems that were doing the question answering. So that again is like open source, and it's very fast. And I think I have a couple of slides that are showing that fastText also like works for text classification a little bit later. So just let's finish the distributed word representations part. I would say that the data sets are often more important than the techniques that you are using. So you should use as large data set with as high quality as possible, and then you will learn just the best models, because otherwise all these word representational learning algorithms are nowadays similar. Then let's go quickly over text classification, because that's super useful in practice. You can actually use this continuous backwards architecture that I was showing to do the text classification directly. So you just sum the word features from the whole sentence, and instead of predicting the middle word or something of that sort, you will predict the label. So in this case, you need the supervision, you need the labels coming from human annotators, but then you are already solving some task that is actually useful for something in practice. For example, you are detecting the sentiment of a sentence, or whether an email is a spam or not. And actually what I wanted to show here is the same story as I was already saying a couple of times before. Like some people that publish, like Jan Lekan with his student, for example, but also others that publish how, for example, deep learning works great for language understanding and so on. And it actually turned out to be the case that you can get better results than these 20 hidden layer neural networks or whatever with convolutions and I don't know what. You can actually get similar or even better results with just the fastText, which is kind of like just slightly more complicated than the logistic regression. And what was the most striking was this comparison between the training times. Like not only we did get better accuracy than Jan and his student, but actually instead of like training on some very expensive GPUs for like a couple of days, just a single epoch, we could train the model in kind of like a few hours, actually not hours, few seconds. Here it's the last column, so it was really much faster. So I think that's again like the same lesson as I was saying before. Like before going into complicated things, it's good to consider the simple things. Not always the simple things work better than the complicated things, but often it's the case, and people should not underestimate the simple ideas because they are very powerful. Then the last section that I have like the last 10 minutes for is the neural language models, which is actually what I did start my research with in like 2006 and so on. And I did write my PhD thesis about neural language models. It's like this super old task going back to Claude Shannon, where we are trying to estimate what is the probability of a word given its history. And then you use it for machine translation, speech recognition, and many other tasks. It's very cool. But here's back the equation that you are just multiplying the probabilities of words given their histories to get the probability of a sentence or just a piece of text. But you will need way too many parameters to estimating the n-grams, which is the count-based techniques from the last century, as I said, which were like dominant for maybe like 30 years. Or people are losing all the hope that we can do better. And then the neural networks actually, through the concept of weight sharing, they can actually overcome these models by a lot. And I can just refer to my PhD thesis if somebody wants to really read all the details. But in short, there were like many myths in the neural network community and NLP community for which reasons people did believe that these neural networks cannot work for language modeling. But even if, for example, Yoshua did publish this paper in 2003, if you would look at how much it was cited, well, nobody was really using it, well, nobody except maybe two or three people were using it in practice because even for people for whom it did somewhat work, it was working just on small data sets, and it was computationally very demanding. It was slow, and whenever you would use larger data sets, it would kind of like stop working because the improvements were vanishing. So things were looking difficult, but I did come with this recurrent language model, which is by just going back to the basics, you take this background language model and you add the context this time by just copying the state of the hidden layer to the input features at the next time step. So you're gonna create this cycle where this st minus one in the figure is copied from the previous time step. That's the state of the hidden layer. And then you assume that the neural network will actually learn the memory on its own using the stochastic gradient descent, where it will actually itself kind of like solve what it wants to remember. And of course, I was not the first one to come up with this concept. There was, for example, Jeff Elman, who was using neural nets, recurrent neural networks already like at the beginning of 90s. He did write some very nice papers, but nobody was actually able to make these models work because there was like this theoretical result that this model will be unstable, that either during the training, the gradients will be going exponentially larger or exponentially smaller. But if they will be going smaller, then the model will have no memory. If they will be going larger, then you will be just kind of like overblowing the weight updates, and the training will be unstable. And that was kind of like the explanation why this model was not really working for everyone. I was luckily not aware of this negative result when I started working with these models, and somehow I made it work by believing that my implementation was buggy. So I did come up with some trick how to deal with this exploding gradient. So I will just skip over the vanishing gradients because there's not that much time to go over them. But when it comes to exploding gradients, basically sometimes it turns out that the gradients, as you propagate them backwards through time, they will be just getting larger and larger, and you will make way too large weight update. And basically the whole network will get destroyed at that moment. Whatever you trained so far, you will just forget it. And in my case, because I didn't know that these models are supposed to not work, I did think that I have a bug in the code, and I did come with just a simple trick that whenever I did observe these gradients to explode, because it was rare, I would clip the gradient size. So there was some maximum threshold over which it couldn't go. So there was basically this hard-coded if in the code, and that was basically sufficient so that the training would be stable even on larger data sets. And then just quickly over the results, it was basically working better than the Feedforward model on this Bench bank data set, which is, I think, still kind of used even today. It's kind of like MNIST for language modeling. The data set was pretty much composed by some people at JHU, but I did slightly modify it and would make it public on my website. So it was one of the first benchmarks that were actually available publicly, which was also like my issue when I was a student. I couldn't really use any publicly available language modeling datasets because they didn't really exist back in the days. There were no competitions, no benchmarks. It was a really difficult field, but I was able to change it by making a couple of datasets on my own. And then again, like there's this somewhat boring part about how to make it really fast and efficient, but would need more time for it. So I'll just quickly go over the slides. There are like these historical ideas that will just compute the probability of the most frequent words using neural networks, and for the rest using the n-grams. Then there was this hierarchical softmax where we just break this large softmax at the end, but I guess I can just skip these. And there was also like some idea that I did like a lot with the combination of the logistic regression and neural network, but again, like no time for it. So that's the paper from language modeling, where some guys from Google that published that basically if you train like 10 of these very large LSTM recurrent networks, that it was working like much better than the n-gram baseline, which was I think around 60 perplexity. So, and there was like 1 billion words, so it was kind of like already proven that you can do much better with neural networks than with Then with the engrams, I think nowadays nobody really believes that engrams are unbeatable anymore. Okay, I'm not gonna explain these LSTMs much, but there's this idea of Jeff Zweig that I did work on together with him 2012, that you can use some extra features in the recurrent nets, and from that you can derive a model that works pretty much as well as LSTM in many cases, while being much simpler conceptually. So you can actually see this as a model with two recurrent layers. One is just diagonal, so we just have the weights on the diagonal, everything else is zero, and the other one is the classic fully connected one. So I did publish it in 2015 as well. That's maybe for people who actually want to understand what these LSTMs learn. So I'm just quickly going over the references. Then by like 2007, there was Holger Schmenk's results about using neural networks for machine translation. He was using it in a competition somewhat successfully, and there was a lot of people who did follow on what he did, like including me and Ashish Vaswani, I think, did publish this paper in 2013, where he did even integrate it into decoding, and things are looking better and better. Then there was this idea that you can actually solve machine translation by just coming with a basically language modeling based translation. I did it in 2012, where I would just take the data set where you have a sentence written in English and then a sentence written in French. That is the translation of the English sentence. And if you have just, say, millions of these sentence pairs, then you can build a machine translation system end to end, just basically training a language model and then showing it the first part, which means the English sentence, and then you can generate the rest through sampling. Well, I was so disappointed that even if I did like the idea a lot, that it was not really working well for anything longer than very short. So I could translate like sentences of this type, like 3-4 words, but it didn't really scale much to anything else. Then when I did show it to my colleagues at Google Brain, they did replace the RNN with LSTM, and they added more hidden layers, and it was working for like a little bit longer sentences. It still was not working that well, but they still did publish it under this name sequence to sequence learning with neural networks or whatever. And that was already like quite well known. And then there was like this kind of like breakthrough paper, I would say, from the Montreal group, from Bahdenau and the others who did actually come up with this neural network end-to-end system that did that attention mechanism, so they could deal much better with longer sentences. And I would say that was the beginning of this modern neural machine translation. And then, of course, there was a lot of follow-up papers. So then the last thing that I have here, of course, like you can pre-train the language models on some unlabeled data like Wikipedia, and then just share it with the community so they can use it as features to their system the same way as Word2Vec, while the language model has an advantage that it understands the word context, the word order, and the disadvantage that it's actually much more computationally demanding than the word vector. So it's useful in some cases where you have a lot of computational resources and where you care about the maximum accuracy that you can get. And otherwise, it's like a good idea. Like nowadays, there's this GPT 2, 3, or whatever is the latest number that people are using. But I would say, like, scientifically, it's still the same things again and again. And of course, people will try to add some boxes there so that it looks like a new thing. But I would say the core idea is to basically just pre-train a large language model on as much data as you can. So useful, but not really gonna take us to AI or whatever. So that's pretty much it. There are just some summary slides that are really like these neural network language models ideas can be tracked back in the history to the 80s, but they started being used only after there were like the successful results on large data sets, which were produced by me in like 2011-12. And that's when the company started investing in this area. There's a few links here, but that's pretty much it. Okay, thanks for the attention, and I guess that we can go back to the questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was really good. Yeah, I have so many thoughts and questions, but I guess I'll leave to the participants' questions. And just I want to clap on behalf of the participants for a really nice talk. And let me sorry, let me open again the questions. Okay, so there's quite a few questions, but yeah, just sort of a note. I'm pretty sure we're not going to be able to go through all of them, but what I can do is I can make a doc with the questions that are left, and I'll send them to you, Tomas. And if you have time, maybe you can answer them in text, and we'll forward them to the participants. Okay, so for the first question, what do you think are the most promising and interesting areas in NLP right now?
Most promising, interesting areas. Well, depends on what you actually want to solve. I would say that the mainstream is already like set for maybe the last 10 years. Then we did see that there are like two core ideas that people should be working on. That's to make the models as large as possible. That means a lot of parameters, which means that you need, say, specialized hardware like GPUs and TPUs and whatever. And the other thing is, of course, the training data, which means that you can come up with some novel data sets. Say the Stanford question answering data set, the squad, for example, I think was interesting. So that's kind of like the mainstream NLP research to have as large model as possible, so trained on as much data as possible. If you make your work useful for the other people, that's even much better, which means that pre-trained models that others can easily use in many tasks like word vectors, language models, and so on. That's gonna always get the most attention in the short term. I think that in the long term, it would be great if we'd be trying to solve problems that are currently not solvable with the machine learning, which in my opinion is the unsupervised learning, building models that can have some real sort of like memory, and even like have some reasonable conversation with us. I think that's super difficult problem. So I wouldn't really say it's the most promising in the sense that you will probably spend a couple of years working on it without any like big breakthrough. But I think people should be really trying, because that's what the real science should be about, to try to solve what actually doesn't really work yet. While if you are trying to solve a problem that we already solved before just by making the model 50% larger, and I would say it's more like engineering than science, but that's my take on it.
Cool. So I guess second question is quite related to the first, so you probably already answered it, but I'm just going to say it anyway in case you want to add something. So what are the most important data sets in NLP to be solved at the moment, which could not be solved by transformers without actually understanding, without actually having understanding of the language, or like linguistics or things like this?
Most important, well, I would say that the most important data sets that we can solve with these statistical techniques that exist today would be, again, something like having, say, smart chatbot, some system that you can communicate with, that can remember what you are saying and use it in the future. It can be shown quite easily that if you just build, again, like a language model based chatbot system that is trying to predict or sample the continuation of a conversation based on the history, that this is like huge issues that are very visible to everyone with the memory, that you can basically define something, some concept, then ask about it later, and the system will struggle with it because the concept of memory seems easy to us as people, but all these models that we have today are having like memory systems that can be shown to be insufficient very easily through examples like I could probably manually write some examples. I did already do it before when I did in 2013. I think I did write this this document that I didn't actually publish, but I did share it with a lot of people. It was called Incremental Learning of Algorithms, and there I did show that that you can make some text examples from which you would want to learn, for example, simple regularities of the sort that you define some task like I have 2 blue balls and 1 red cube, and then you ask the system how many cubes or balls you have and what is red and what is blue. And if you define just a very toyish, like a childish language sentences of this sort, and then test which language model will be able to generalize in these contexts, you will find that none of them actually. It's very difficult, and then you can always like modify these examples to be slightly more complicated language, and then you see that very quickly these statistical language models are breaking there.
Cool. So for the next questions, what do you think is really attention what we all need? What's your take on attention for NLP?
Well, it depends. If you are some author of the paper and you just need all the citations, then that's definitely a good title for it. But otherwise, no, I think that this attention mechanism, although I didn't never like actually its name because it seems to be making some links to neuroscience or brains. But I think that conceptually it was one of the most exciting ideas from the last decade, and I believe there will be Kyung-Gyun Cho presenting it maybe today, so you will hear about it more. But I definitely don't think it's all that we need because, again, like if you have like these memory tasks where you define something simple in the language and then you ask about it again, and or you try to make a chatbot that will be able to talk with you as like with the same quality as like 5-year-old child, you will quickly find that it's impossible and difficult to explain what is the difficult part, but basically people can learn in very like unsupervised way, while our like machine learning techniques are more like some super parrots. Like they are very good at memorization. They can repeat whole sentences that they did see in the training data quite well. But when it comes to some sort of like generalization or some reasoning, as people call it, then that's like really like a difficult part.
Okay, let's do a couple more questions. So the next one is, what do you think about causal inference in NLP?
Causal inference in NLP? Well, I'm not sure. I never did work on it, so that would be probably not be something that I can answer.
Okay. The next question is, do you think self-supervision is the way to go for NLP? If not, can you provide one example of a task problem we cannot solve with self-supervision?
Well, it's an interesting question because I did believe for many years that it may be enough because self-supervision is basically like what language models are about. There's even like there were like people like say Marcus Hutter who did publish this kind of like AI competition where the goal was to compress the Wikipedia as much as possible, which can be shown to be exactly the same thing as when we are minimizing the perplexity of a language model. And his arguments were that the best model, the best language model with the lowest perplexity would have to understand the language, which actually I agree with. The question is, how can we get to that point? And when we are already like at these levels of very low perplexities, well, people are even worse than these language models at some point at predicting what is the next word, but we can still understand the longer context much better. So I actually believe that self-supervision is not gonna work for building AI or like building models that really understand language the same way as if you have, say, autistic people who just observe like things that we don't care about around us because they just study some details and they're counting some objects. And so they are kind of like distant when it comes to interaction to our world. I have the same feeling from our machine learning techniques today that they are kind of autistic as well, that they are caring too much about the details that we humans don't care about, while the important things that are important for us are kind of like hidden for these models. So I would like to see more like data sets where, for example, like say question answering, where you would have like full conversation, where you can test whether the system did understand things the same way as we do. Kind of like when you have children who go to school in the first grade, they can answer some basic questions and they can use the context. They can memorize sentences and reproduce facts and so on. And they can do it like from the self-supervision kind of, because they just observe basically the signal. So there's no like explicit supervision there. And I think that these would be like great data sets to show, sorry, that it's really difficult for the current machine learning to solve this, including whether you have attention or 50 hidden layers or whatever. It's just not going to cut it. So I think that there's some sort of like evolution of the data sets that are being used by the community and the techniques themselves. So we mostly work on problems that we can already solve, but then there are problems that the current machine learning cannot solve, and it's difficult to publish papers about these problems because if you come to ICML or whatever NIPS with a data set that is currently not solvable by machine learning, and that's it, then you will not get the paper accepted, and then it's super difficult to even work on these data sets. So I think it's kind of like this vicious cycle in some sense, that the machine learning community that log itself in some local optimum, that we are working on tasks that we already could solve 10 years ago, and we are just making the models bigger and some new fancy boxes that are not really necessary. And if we are to overcome it, then I think we should get more to the basics and realize what we actually want in the long term from machine learning and from AI research, and define tasks without actually thinking about the models that we have at the hand, and just define tasks that we believe are important and that are not unnecessarily complex, so that we believe that they can be solved.
The last question. What do you recommend when dealing with small NLP datasets?
Small NLP datasets were, well, the most boring answer that's gonna be probably most useful if you are like in working somewhere on some practical tasks, then the best thing would be to make the dataset bigger, which means to try to look for different sources of the data, annotate more data. Like often people just have, say, 100 labeled examples, and they are trying to apply some fancy neural language models to the problem that they have. And where if they would just manually label another 100 examples, they can improve their performance much more, even if they use logistic regression as a model, than if they will spend another week or month by trying to tune some new transformer language model. So I think that depends on whether you care about the performance, like as an engineer, then I would say that just try to do whatever to get more data. And if you are like a researcher, which means that you just want to really deal with a small data set and just learn more regularities, then I think that, again, like doing transfer learning from other tasks, which is to use pre-trained word vectors, pre-trained language models, that's probably going to help your generalization, because then your system doesn't need to learn from like 10 labeled examples that Monday and Tuesday should share parameters, but you already have this given from the pre-trained language model or word vector model. So I think that transfer learning for small data sets is definitely a good idea. But even simpler answer would be, if you just care about the performance, just get more annotations. That's it. Make the small data set big.
Okay, cool. Thanks again for the lecture. This was amazing. And yeah, let's clap. And
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.